the Surigao Strait,
3:53 a.m. October 25, 1944.
The massive Japanese
Northern
battleship
entrance to the
advances.
Surigao Strait, Philippines. The bridge of the USS West Virginia is almost completely dark. There is no moon worth mentioning. No silhouette on the horizon. No enemy in sight. And yet every man on the bridge knows exactly where the Japanese battleship Yamashiro is. Not because they can see her. Because a glowing radar screen has been following her for nearly 40 minutes. Then, at roughly 22,000 yards, West Virginia fires. 16-inch guns roar into the darkness. Seconds later, the first salvo lands. A direct hit. On a battleship the crew has never laid eyes on. 18 minutes later, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf gives an order almost impossible to believe. Cease fire. Not because the ammunition is running low. Not because the enemy escaped. Because there is almost nothing left to shoot at. An entire Japanese battle force has been shattered in less than 20 minutes. But here's the part most people never hear. Those 18 minutes were not what destroyed Japan's fleet. By the time the American battleships opened fire, the battle had already been decided. Because Oldendorf hadn't prepared for a battle. He had quietly built something far more dangerous. A machine. One designed to destroy an entire fleet. Layer by layer. And once the Japanese entered the Surigao Strait, there was no way back. Most histories remember the Battle of Surigao Strait for one reason. It was the last battleship-versus-battleship battle in history. That is true. But it also hides the real story. Because this was never simply a duel between giant warships. It was one of the most carefully engineered naval ambushes of the Second World War. For decades, people have focused on the thunder of the American battleships. The radar. The devastating broadsides. The 18-minute gun duel. But those moments were only the final stage. The real victory had been assembled long before the first shell crossed the water. Oldendorf studied one narrow stretch of sea and realized something extraordinary. He didn't need a stronger fleet. He didn't need better ships. He only needed to make sure the Japanese had exactly one path to follow. And once they committed to it, every mile they advanced would trigger another layer of destruction. The further they sailed, the fewer choices they had. Which raises the real question. If the trap was so obvious, why did Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura continue straight into it? To answer that, we have to rewind 2 days earlier, when Japan launched one of the most desperate naval operations of the entire Pacific War. October 1944. The Japanese Empire was running out of time. American forces had landed on Leyte in the Philippines. On paper, it looked like another island campaign. In reality, it threatened the survival of Japan itself. The Philippines sat across the sea lanes carrying oil and raw materials from Southeast Asia to the Japanese home islands. Lose the Philippines, and the empire would begin to suffocate. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood the stakes. If the invasion succeeded, Japan would lose far more than another battlefield. It could lose the ability to continue the war. So Tokyo made a decision unlike anything it had attempted before. Nearly every major warship still capable of fighting would be committed to one enormous operation. Not because victory looked likely. Because there were almost no alternatives left. The operation became known as Shogo. Its design was breathtakingly ambitious. 3 separate naval forces would attack from different directions. To American planners, it would appear chaotic. To Japanese planners, it was supposed to become the decisive counterstroke that shattered the invasion fleet. From the north, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the most powerful force through the San Bernardino Strait. Another group of nearly empty aircraft carriers would act as bait, drawing Admiral Halsey's fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf. And from the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would force the Surigao Strait with 2 aging battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. If everything happened exactly on schedule, the American invasion fleet would be trapped between converging Japanese surface forces. On maps, the plan looked brilliant. In reality, it depended on flawless timing, perfect coordination, reliable communications, and commanders arriving at the same place from hundreds of miles apart. During wartime, at night, under constant American attack, almost none of those conditions existed anymore. Japanese naval aviation had already been shattered months earlier. Air cover was almost non-existent. American submarines hunted aggressively across the Pacific. Carrier aircraft dominated the skies. Radar had transformed night combat. Yet the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing to fight as though many of those changes had never happened. Even more troubling, the Southern attack force itself was dangerously fragile. Nishimura's flagship, Yamashiro, and her sister ship, Fuso, were relics from another era. Both battleships had been designed during the First World War. They had been modernized over the years. But beneath the towering pagoda masts and upgraded equipment remained ships built for a different generation of naval warfare. They were slower. Their armor reflected older assumptions. And unlike Japan's famous fast battleships, they had seen relatively little combat. Even worse, another Japanese force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima was also heading toward the Surigao Strait. But astonishingly, the two admirals had no unified battle plan. No integrated command. Very little meaningful communication. They were sailing toward the same narrow channel. On the same night. To fight the same enemy. Without coordinating how they would actually do it. That failure would become one of the most important hidden factors in everything that followed. Because while Japan was still trying to synchronize separate fleets across hundreds of miles, Jesse Oldendorf was preparing something far simpler. And infinitely more deadly. Jesse Oldendorf had one advantage that every commander dreams about. Time. Not much. Just enough. American reconnaissance, patrol boats, submarines, and air attacks had already revealed that a Japanese force was moving toward the Surigao Strait. Instead of rushing south to meet it in open water, Oldendorf asked a different question. Why fight the enemy where he still has choices? When geography can take those choices away. The Surigao Strait was unlike almost any other battlefield in the Pacific. Long. Narrow. Confined by islands. A fleet entering from the south had only one practical route north. There was almost no room to maneuver. Almost no room to deploy into a proper battle line. And almost no chance of turning an entire battleship formation around once it committed. On a map, it looked like a channel. To Oldendorf, it looked like a funnel. And that single realization changed everything. Most admirals would have arranged their strongest ships at the front and waited for the decisive clash. Oldendorf did the opposite. He imagined the battle as a machine. Each layer would perform one simple task. Not one decisive blow. A chain of blows. Each making the next one even more lethal. The first layer would find the enemy. The second would weaken him. The third would finish what was left. If every layer worked, the Japanese fleet would never reach the American battle line intact. And if it didn't arrive intact, the final gun duel would no longer be a duel at all. It would become an execution. The brilliance of the plan wasn't its complexity. It was its simplicity. Every Japanese decision would become predictable. Every mile north would force them exactly where Oldendorf wanted them to go. The trap wasn't waiting at the end of the strait. The trap was the strait. The first layer of Oldendorf's machine wasn't built from battleships. It was built from some of the smallest combat vessels in the American Navy. 39 PT boats. Fast. Light. Made largely of wood. Against battleships, they looked almost absurd. Their crews joked that attacking a capital ship in a PT boat was like charging a tank on a motorcycle. Yet Oldendorf wasn't asking them to stop the Japanese fleet. He was asking them to do something far more valuable. See everything. The boat spread across nearly 50 miles of water, forming a moving tripwire at the southern entrance to the strait. Every captain understood the assignment. If you could fire a torpedo, fire it. If you couldn't, report. Above all, keep reporting. Position. Heading. Speed. Every sighting raced north by radio. Slowly, almost minute by minute, Oldendorf watched the Japanese advance unfold without ever leaving his command post. For Nishimura, the experience was completely different. One moment, the sea appeared empty. The next, small American boats burst from the darkness, launching torpedoes before disappearing again. Searchlights swept the water. Heavy guns thundered into the night. Shadow after shadow appeared, attacked, and vanished. Materially, the PT boats accomplished very little. They fired dozens of torpedoes. None struck a Japanese warship. One PT boat was destroyed. Several sailors were killed. Measured only by damage inflicted. The mission looked like a failure. But Oldendorf had never measured success that way. Every attack forced Japanese lookouts to remain alert. Every burst of gunfire kept crews at battle stations. Every report flowing north sharpened the American picture of the battlefield. Hour after hour, the Japanese column burned energy. Burned concentration. Burned confidence. Without realizing it, Nishimura's fleet was exhausting itself before the real battle had even begun. And there was another consequence. Far more important than any torpedo hit. Surprise disappeared. By around 10 o'clock that night, Oldendorf knew almost exactly where the Japanese force was. How fast it was moving. And when it would arrive. The darkness that should have protected Nishimura now protected the Americans instead. The hidden advantage wasn't vision. It was information. And information was quietly becoming the deadliest weapon in the strait. But Oldendorf's machine had only activated its first layer. The second layer was waiting silently against both shorelines. And unlike the PT boats, its mission was to kill. By now, it would be easy to think the battle was already over. The Japanese had been detected. They had lost the element of surprise. Their crews had spent hours fighting shadows in the darkness. But none of that explains why an entire battle line disappeared in less than 20 minutes. Because Oldendorf hadn't built a warning system. He had built a sequence. Every layer existed for one purpose. To make the next layer even deadlier. The PT boats had found the enemy. Now the destroyers would break him. And only after that would the battleship speak. This is where the story changes. Because most people remember Surigao Strait as the last great battleship duel. The evidence says something very different. The battleships finished the battle. They did not decide it. Oldendorf placed his destroyers exactly where Nishimura couldn't effectively fight them. Not directly ahead. Not behind. Along both shorelines. Hidden by darkness. Waiting for the Japanese column to sail past. The plan demanded discipline. The destroyers would not charge recklessly. They would attack in carefully timed waves. As Nishimura steamed north at roughly 20 knots, the first American destroyers slipped away from the shoreline. Closing rapidly. 4 miles. 3 miles. Then. A full spread of torpedoes raced into the Japanese column. The destroyers didn't stay to admire the results. They turned sharply. Dropped smoke. And disappeared back into the darkness. Minutes later. Another wave attacked. Then another. Every attack came from a different angle. Every explosion forced Nishimura to react. Every maneuver disrupted the formation a little more. For the Japanese lookouts, the darkness had become chaos. Searchlights swept desperately across empty water. Heavy guns fired toward fleeting silhouettes that were already gone. The Americans had learned painful lessons during the brutal night battles around Guadalcanal. Earlier in the war, Japanese destroyers had repeatedly humiliated American surface forces with aggressive torpedo tactics. The U.S. Navy studied every defeat. Every mistake. Every after-action report. By late 1944, those lessons had been transformed into doctrine. Destroyer squadrons now trained to strike in coordinated waves, launch at close range, and withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. At Surigao Strait. That doctrine reached perfection. Then the torpedoes began to hit. The destroyer Yamagumo exploded so violently that American sailors miles away saw the flash light up the night. Michishio was crippled. Asagumo lost her bow. Then came the blow that changed everything. The battleship Fuso took a devastating torpedo hit. She fell out of formation. Burning. Slowing. Eventually disappearing into the darkness behind the rest of the column. For decades, stories claimed Fuso exploded into 2 burning halves. Modern examinations of the wreck have cast doubt on that famous version. What is well supported is simpler, and, in many ways, more important. She was crippled by torpedoes. Caught fire. And was lost before the American battle line ever fired a shot. That single fact changes the entire story. The weapon most people remember wasn't the weapon that broke the fleet. It was the destroyers. Small ships. Fast ships. Ships a fraction of the size of the battleships they had just crippled. By the time Nishimura pushed farther north, his formation was already collapsing. One battleship was effectively lost. Several destroyers were sinking or disabled. His flagship, Yamashiro, had also taken torpedo damage and was flooding. Yet Nishimura did something that still puzzles historians. He transmitted a report stating that the formation remained operational. Then, he ordered the advance to continue. Not around the trap. Not away from it. Straight into its final layer. Because he still believed the decisive battle lay ahead. He didn't realize. The decisive battle had already happened. And waiting beyond the northern end of the strait. 3 American battleships had spent the last 35 minutes watching his every move. Without ever seeing a single ship with human eyes. Everything about Surigao Strait seems to point toward one conclusion. Superior firepower won. 6 American battleships. Cruisers. Destroyers. against a battered Japanese column. But that's only what happened on the surface. Because Oldendorf's greatest weapon wasn't a battleship. It wasn't even radar. It was something much harder to see. Control. Control of time. Control of information. Control of geography. By the moment Nishimura reached the northern end of the strait, every important decision had already been made, for him. The route. The speed. The direction. Even the place where he would die. The Japanese admiral still believed he was approaching the decisive engagement. Oldendorf knew the decisive engagement had already been engineered. The battleships were simply waiting to make it visible. At 3:16 in the morning, aboard the USS West Virginia, operators watched glowing radar returns move steadily across their plotting tables. The enemy was still more than 42,000 yards away. Nearly 24 miles. No lookout could see that far. Not in daylight. Certainly not in almost total darkness. But radar could. For the next 35 minutes, no American battleship fired. No commander rushed the engagement. No one broke formation. Instead, fire control teams quietly refined one calculation after another. Course. Speed. Bearing. Range. Every minute the solution became more accurate. The Japanese never realized they had already entered a firing solution. Imagine what that felt like aboard Yamashiro. Hours of harassment. Torpedo attacks from invisible destroyers. Searchlights probing empty darkness. Reports of damaged ships behind you. Then. Silence. For a few brief moments, nothing happened. It might even have felt as though the worst was over. It wasn't. It was merely the pause before the final layer activated. At approximately 3:53 a.m., the radar operators aboard West Virginia confirmed the range. Oldendorf gave permission. The great guns fired. The first American salvo crossed 22,000 yards of darkness toward a target nobody aboard could actually see. Seconds later, observers watched towering columns of water erupt around Yamashiro. Then came the impossible confirmation. The opening salvo had found its mark. Almost instantly, the rest of the American line joined in. Not every battleship contributed equally. Only 3 possessed the newest fire control radar capable of long-range blind shooting with real precision. Those 3 carried most of the fight. To the Japanese sailors, it must have seemed unreal. Heavy shells crashed into the flagship from somewhere beyond the darkness. There were no clear targets. No visible battle line stretching across the horizon. Only explosions. Fire. Steel. And destruction arriving from an enemy they could barely locate. Still. Yamashiro fought back. Her forward turrets turned toward the flashes that finally became visible. She answered with everything she still had. The heavy cruiser Mogami fired. The destroyer Shigure fired. 3 battered ships. Against an entire prepared battle line. The exchange lasted only about 18 minutes. By then, Yamashiro had been struck repeatedly. Fires consumed her upper decks. Flooding spread through the hull. The surviving Japanese formation no longer resembled a battle fleet. It resembled wreckage still moving forward. Then came one final order from Oldendorf. Cease fire. Not because victory was uncertain. Because continuing to fire risked hitting his own destroyers still operating farther south. The shooting stopped. But the outcome had already become irreversible. The last battleship duel in history had ended almost as soon as it began. And remarkably, The famous battleship duel wasn't what had truly destroyed Japan's southern force. The destroyers had already done that. The radar-directed broadside simply completed what Oldendorf's machine had started hours earlier. Yet the story still wasn't over. Because the deepest irony of Surigao Strait had nothing to do with radar, or torpedoes, or even the 18-minute gun duel. It began nearly 3 years earlier. On another quiet Sunday morning. At a place called Pearl Harbor. As the burning wreck of Yamashiro drifted south, the battle itself was already over. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura never escaped the Surigao Strait. His flagship rolled, capsized, and disappeared beneath the water before dawn. More than 1,500 men had sailed aboard Yamashiro. Only a handful survived. His body was never recovered. To this day, he remains where his flagship went down. But even that wasn't the most remarkable part of the night. Because while the Japanese fleet was dying, history was quietly completing a circle. Look at the 6 American battleships waiting across the northern end of the strait. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. 5 of those 6 ships shared something extraordinary. They had already fought Japan once. Not in victory. In disaster. On the morning of December 7, 1941, they had been bombed, torpedoed, sunk, or badly damaged at Pearl Harbor. Some settled onto the harbor floor. Others burned at their moorings. Many experts believed several would never return to service. But the United States Navy refused to abandon them. Divers entered flooded compartments filled with oil, twisted steel, and darkness. Working almost entirely by touch, they patched holes from the inside. Pumped out thousands of tons of water. Raised battleships that had effectively become underwater wrecks. Then those ships crossed the Pacific to American shipyards. They weren't simply repaired. They were transformed. New anti-aircraft batteries. New fire control systems. Most importantly, new radar. Technology that scarcely mattered in 1941 had become decisive by 1944. And now came the irony. The Japanese attack that had nearly destroyed those ships had forced the United States to rebuild them into something even more dangerous. 3 years after Pearl Harbor, those same battleships waited silently across a narrow Philippine channel, watching another Japanese battle line steam toward them. This time, Japan was the side sailing into the trap. That symmetry wasn't planned. No admiral designed it. No operational order mentioned revenge. But many of the sailors standing on those American decks had lived through Pearl Harbor themselves. Some had watched friends die in burning compartments. Some had helped pull survivors from black, oil-covered water. Now they stood behind radar screens and fire control computers aboard the very ships Japan had once believed destroyed. The fleet that had begun America's war. Helped end Japan's last battleship battle. And yet, even after such a perfect victory, the night held one final twist. Because while Oldendorf was annihilating Nishimura in the south, another Japanese fleet was approaching from the north. And this time, the Americans wouldn't be waiting. This is where Surigao Strait becomes far more than a remarkable battle. It becomes a lesson in how wars actually change. Oldendorf didn't invent a revolutionary weapon. He combined existing ones more intelligently than his opponent. Patrol boats. Destroyers. Radar. Battleships. Most importantly, geography. Each layer solved a different problem. The PT boats found the enemy. The destroyers broke the formation. Radar eliminated darkness. The battle line delivered the final blow. None of those pieces alone guaranteed victory. Together, they became a system. That system explains why Japanese losses were so devastating. 2 battleships lost. Multiple destroyers destroyed. A heavy cruiser eventually abandoned. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors killed. American losses were astonishingly small by comparison. The exchange wasn't simply one fleet shooting better than another. It was one commander arranging every stage of the battle before the enemy fully understood what was happening. But Surigao Strait also exposed something much larger. For decades, naval doctrine had revolved around the decisive battleship engagement. Massive fleets meeting in open water. Great guns deciding history. Japan had trained for that vision longer than almost anyone. Ironically, when the Imperial Japanese Navy finally received the battleship duel it had dreamed about, it arrived on the wrong side of the formation. Inside a narrow channel. Against radar-guided ships. After destroyers had already crippled the fleet. The decisive battleship battle finally happened. Just as battleships themselves were becoming obsolete. Aircraft had already proven their dominance. Submarines were reshaping naval warfare. Radar had changed night combat forever. Surigao Strait wasn't the beginning of a new era. It was the last perfect example of the old one. And perhaps that's why so many people misunderstand it. They remember the 18-minute gun duel. They forget the 6 hours of preparation that made those 18 minutes inevitable. The hidden truth was never the accuracy of American battleships. It was Oldendorf's understanding that victory begins long before the first shot is fired. Today, ferries and fishing boats cross the Surigao Strait almost every day. Beneath those waters, the wrecks are still there. Yamashiro. Fuso. Destroyers that never reached their destination. Thousands of sailors remain entombed inside steel hulls resting on the seabed. Above them, the water is quiet. Almost nothing suggests that one of history's most perfectly executed naval ambushes happened there. Most people remember the desperate heroism off Samar later that same morning. Far fewer remember the battle fought a few hours earlier, where an American admiral quietly built a machine that left an enemy fleet with no choices. No escape. And almost no chance. The last great battleship duel in history lasted only 18 minutes. But its outcome had been decided hours before the first gun ever fired. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of Surigao Strait. The greatest victories are rarely won by the strongest force. They are won by the commander who shapes the battlefield so completely that the enemy mistakes inevitability for opportunity.